All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another office hour section. There's no, well, there are a few announcements that we should make. Exam 3 has, everybody's taken it now and it's been graded. And a few students have reached out with questions about some of their scores or the exam questions themselves, which is great, and I encourage that. If you ever think that you didn't receive full points, please, reach out about the specific question, provide a biological reasoning or argument for why you think you answered the question correctly, and I will be happy to reconsider individual questions that you provide that type of response to. Um, we're human. Sometimes we miss things. Myself and the TAs, we grade 60 plus exams each. So reading those same 5 questions over and over again, sometimes we just miss something. Other times it gives us an opportunity to explain in a little bit more detail than provided on the answer key why you did not receive those points, but it can't hurt to ask, because either you're going to receive, full credit back, partial credit back, or at least, with no credit, just a better explanation and understanding of that question. Um, and then, as you can tell, we're a little over halfway through the course. We have exam 4 coming up already, right? That's this Friday. So we'll be covering sections T14, 15, and 16 today. And then tomorrow we can cover the last 2 sections. So again, like exam 3, there are 5 sections for this exam. Now I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can go through the Cogbooks materials together. Okay, can everybody see my screen or my thing of Cogbooks right here?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So with T14, we can just kind of jump right in. That gets us into the topic of competition. So, and it starts off with this catching up of the garlic mustard, or catching up to the garlic mustard. That actually makes more sense. It just shows that this is a type of plant that is very competitive. It grows really quickly, and it can often, it's invasive in a sense where it can now compete the local plants. However, they've been studying this plant for quite some time, and they found 2 key characteristics, or 2 kind of changes in the environment. Does anybody want to take a stab or know what those 2 changes in the environment that they found are? One's related to the garlic mustard itself, and one's related to the local plants.
I remember it. I remember it being the garlic mustard produces like a toxin, so then it makes the soil toxic. And then so then the fungi that supports native plants can't survive, and so then it kills off native plants. But does it have to do with the environment, or that's like an individual plant?
That's right on track of where I was going with this. So that's maybe I went a little too fast. So if we do back up like you did, is great. That's kind of the story, right? This plant, the garlic mustard, is a very good competitor because it produces this toxin that it puts into the ground, and that hurts or prevents other plants from growing. So that's how its competitive advantage. But in studying it, one thing they found is that over time, in areas that are older, they find that this plant is producing less and less of this toxin. So one hypothesis is that it's becoming a less dominant competitor. But when they did some experiments with it, they actually found that the native plants were starting to actually evolve and become more tolerant to this toxin. So it's kind of going in both directions, and that's the whole catching up to the garlic mustard. Is there's been a change in its competition. It's actually a weaker competitor than it used to be. So it's not as prolific in older communities as it is in newer communities. And then this kind of gets really kind of like the nuts and bolts of competition. So the big overarching theme here too is organisms compete for a reason. And that reason is they have resources are limited. So here breaks down a little bit the different types of competition. So we have intra-specific competition versus inter-specific competition. And what is, briefly in a sentence or two, the difference between these types of competition?
One's competition against the same species, and then one is against different species.
Yeah, and that's kind of, we break down the word, intra is like within, so that's competition within species. So say you have bumblebees would be your example, maybe. Bumblebees would be competing against each other for access to a flower. They're the same species of bumblebee. And then you have interspecific competition. So inter means between, and that's competition among different types of species. So maybe bumblebees and wasps, they're different species. Or it could even, it could be like deer and plants or something, anything just that are two different species. And then they get in a little bit to Liebig's law of the minimum. What is this kind of briefly stating?
That a population can basically increase until the most limiting resource runs out, which would then prevent the population from growing any further.
Yeah, so they're limited to the most limiting resource of that environment. So if we think of plants, what are some limiting resources to plants in an environment?
Nutrients. So like, I know they talked a lot about nitrogen.
And it could be multiple, right? It could be nitrogen, it could be phosphorus, it could be carbon in the soil, and those are all independent nutrients according to Liebig's law of the minimum. And whichever one of those three are the most limiting are going to set kind of what that population size can be. So it considers all of these nutrients independent. Now, and it gave some examples here and showed how species kind of, so this, we have two types of, I think, what are these, nematodes or something? So microorganisms or diatoms, thank you, yeah. Some small organisms, and they feed on this silica. So if they put it, what they did is they put them separate first, right? And their population initially increases and drops this population, which is their limiting resource. And then they kind of hit their carrying capacity and stabilize. And the same pattern is seen for the second species, the Sendra, or however you pronounce that, called species B. But we notice a little bit of a difference that these levels, they're not zero, right? So these are above zero, and these are closer to zero. So this organism B uses more of the resource, or it can live off of less of the resource. And that's why we see when they're put together, the purple line is they both increase initially, but when it drops below that threshold for Esterinella species A drops down, and then the purple species here stays at a higher carrying capacity. So essentially it lives off of less of a resource, so it does better. It's not as limited by that resource. It can live at lower levels of that resource. But with Liebig's law of the minimum, with that assumption that all resources are independent, does that hold true across the board in ecology?
No. There was
Yeah, right.
There was a good example of like, just as like species increase, oxygen, like its relationship to oxygen, like they don't need more oxygen because oxygen doesn't run out in the same way. So like the other minimum thing would be something else. Like
Yeah, so some resources that are required for life, such as oxygen, are not limited, right? Unless you're in a cave possibly, or in some hypoxic environment. So, but most of the time, some resources are not limited, are limiting. But also, as we get in this section, it shows that some resources tend to interact, right? So they looked at light intensity and fertilizer and looked at the plant dry mass, so basically the size of the plant. And when they had no fertilizer and just did light, they found that increasing amounts of light generally tended to increase the size of the plant up to a certain level. But when they added fertilizer, it like magnified that effect, right? So we still see the same pattern, but at higher levels. So there's an interactive effect between light and fertilizer that can have impacts on organisms. So they're not necessarily, Liebig's law of the minimum holds in some scenarios, but does not hold across the board in ecology is kind of the point, that sometimes there are some interactions of resources, or sometimes organisms need two resources to survive. And if they run low on both of them, they can't survive. It's not necessarily just one or the other. So we understand that the principle, what Liebig's law of the minimum is, it does state that it is the single limiting resource. But again, that's not always the case. All right, and then they get into the competitive exclusion principle. What does this talk about?
Basically just that two species can't coexist indefinitely if they're both limited by the same resource.
Yeah, so it's a great way to describe what the principle states. So again, they did an experiment where they have two organisms and they show them first individually. They just, with kind of unlimited resources, the population grows, reaches a carrying capacity. And then when they have them in the same environment, one species kind of, I think, obtains the resource at a better rate. So it's able to maintain a higher population, and the other organism kind of initially increases, but then declines to low levels and eventually might go extinct if it can't obtain that resource with this other organism kind of obtaining it first or interfering. They don't talk about how they're interacting, but they just talk that this is a superior competitor. But we also think one thing to point out too is, even though this organism in the light blue line is a superior competitor, this organism is still using resources, so it's only at 150 about, or a little bit less, compared to when it's by itself, it's almost hitting 200. So this organism, the inferior competitor, still has some negative effects on the superior competitor by keeping both of their numbers below their carrying capacities. Okay, and then we get into some examples. So competition between closely related species. And this is, Cogwicks describes as this can be high levels of competition because closely related species generally have similar traits. So they have similar defenses. They also have similar needs because of those traits. So they have an example here where they have two types of bed straw. So the heath bed straw and white bed straw, and they're in two different soil types, one in alkaline soil and one in acidic soil. And when they grow them, the heath bed straw by itself, it does better in acidic soil because it's normally found in more acidic soils. It does grow in the alkaline soil, but as you can see in the top two boxes, just not as, it doesn't do as well. The white bed straw, we see the opposite, right? That grows really well in the alkaline soil and it grows in the acidic soil, but not as high as numbers or as well overall as it does in the alkaline soil. And then when we put them together, it's not too surprising what we find. The white bed straw that grew well in the alkaline soil outcompetes and still does better in the alkaline soil, even in the presence of the other bed straw. And these, again, we see the opposite in the acidic soil. The heath bed straw does better because that's generally where it's found. So the environment can have an impact on competition. Okay, and then they get into competition about distantly related species. And even though they're distantly related, they sometimes still need some of the same resources. So they compete over space, or they compete over food sources. And sometimes they can coexist and sometimes they can't coexist. It depends on how severe that competition is, how limited the resources are, and how many differences there are, how different the level of competition is. So if one is a much more, a much superior competitor, it could wipe that population out of its inferior competitors at a higher rate or shorter amount of time than if they're more equal in competition. Kind of the example they gave here, where the two species essentially coexist in competition, is rodents and ants, right? Where they're both collecting seeds. The ants could coexist essentially because they could collect the really small seeds that the rodents didn't collect, and they didn't collect as many of the larger seeds that the rodents did collect. So there's kind of a trade-off. They sacrifice seed size for getting access to those seeds, because the rodents in general kind of a more superior competitor, but the ants found a way to stay alive by eating the smaller seeds that the rodents tended to bypass. All right, so then we get into the theory of competition, and as we can see, when we calculate competition, there can be a lot of math involved that we saw like on the last exam. But considering there's no examples for us to practice this, or no activities rather for us to practice this, I'll come out and just tell everybody there will be 0 calculations of this on the exam. But we can't ignore the equations. We do need to know what the variables stand for, and we can be asked, if we were to increase this variable, what would the net outcome of this competition be, right? So we increase the number of the population for one species over the other, it's probably going to tip the scales in that species' favor. If we increase the carrying capacity of one competitor over the other, it's probably going to tip the scales again in that species' favor. So we're not going to have to know how to convert all of these, and they talk about competition coefficients. It's probably good to know in general what they are, right? So if we have alpha and beta here as our competition coefficients, in a sentence or two, how would we describe what those are? Why do they exist?
Is it you said why does alpha and beta exist?
Yeah, so well, why do they exist? What do they do for us in this competition equation?
Oh, do they compare the survival of, or like the survival of in different species? So like if you're comparing A and B, that's
It's not necessarily the survival, but between different species is on the right track, because when we have competition, we have at least 2 organisms, right? It can be, if it's interspecific, we have at least 2 different species competing against each other. We call it species 1, species 2. It doesn't matter what they are. But if we're going to compare the change in population of species 1, so n is like the number of that species 1, and 2 is the number of species 2, right? So if we're going to look at calculations for each one of them, we need to have this competition coefficient, which is just a conversion factor, right? So say we have squirrels competing against robins for seeds. And we say, how many squirrels equal how many robins? It's not usually 1-to-1, right? Squirrels might be better at collecting seeds. Robins is a terrible example because they don't really eat seeds, but let's just say a bird and a squirrel. It might be 13 squirrels are worth 16 birds, right? So if it's not 1-to-1, this is a conversion factor of how many it would take of the other species to reach that competition level. Does that make sense?
so yes. So if we were to, you're just comparing, you're saying like how many predators, like it wouldn't even use the word predators. You're right. Oh wait, okay, let me just sum it up. So you're saying that the alpha and beta are converting. I don't know, dude. I kind of get it, but I don't know. If you can explain it in a different way, I think that would be helpful.
Sure. So the way they word it is right here, is that it converts between the number of individuals of one species and the number of individuals of the other species. So if we have wolves and mountain lions, wolves are species 1, mountain lions are species 2. And we want to convert between the number. It's this, it might be that 3 wolves are at the level of competition as 1 mountain lion. So in order to figure out it's 3-to-1, we have to have these conversion factors. And I'm not going to get into the math of how we do it. I just want to get that core principle across.
Okay. I think I got it.
Is that making sense to the group
Yeah,
too?
yeah.
Or?
That was better for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Because eventually what it does is you can go back and forth, and you can essentially right here K1, you can solve for K1 and get N1 and use these conversion factors to get, what does this say? How does it describe it? So where will the populations achieve equilibrium is kind of what these equations are getting to know what would be a balanced system between competition and what would be an unbalanced system between competition. But again, like I said, I don't want to get into the nitty gritty of this because we're not going to do it on the exam. So what I want to get into more are these visual, because I think these make, for visual learners, these make a lot of sense because we can actually see kind of what's happening and how we can reach carrying capacities and how we can reach equilibriums and have different scenarios of winners, losers, or coexistence in competition. So this starts very basic in these figures right here, where what we have is we have this is for species 1 on the left. So N1 is the population of species 1 on the x-axis for both of them. And on the y-axis, it's the population of species 2. But what we see is we only have one carrying capacity. K1 is the carrying capacity for species 1. And this is they call it an isocline. And this relates to what the population sizes are and what the populations are going to do. So in this scenario, if we're somewhere in here, so some value of N1 below the isocline, you see the arrows are pushing to the right, no matter where we are on this blue triangle, it's going to have we're below the isocline or equilibrium of species 1, essentially below the carrying capacity of species 1 is another way to put it. Species 1 is going to increase in number until it reaches its carrying capacity. And that's why the isocline then goes all the way to the bottom of for the carrying capacity. If we're anywhere up here for species 1, it's above the isocline, so it's above carrying capacity. It's going to shift to the left and it's going to go towards that isocline, which is the equilibrium, and it's going to bring the number for species 1 down. And then the one on the right here, this is focused on species B. So they're vertical because this is focused with the y-axis, which is species B or species 2. And these are horizontal left to right because it's just focused with the x-axis, which is species 1. And what I think will make a little more sense is when we combine them. So that's kind of just the introduction of it. But then this gives us 4 scenarios where we have 2 species and now we have them on the same chart. So we actually get an outcome of competition and we get 4 different possible outcomes. All right, so what's the outcome of this one? Does everybody understand these a little bit? Want to take a stab at it? So the top left box, what do we think the outcome would be?
When you say outcome, you're talking about a specific species or the
Well,
competition between the two species?
the outcome of the competition, that's a good question. Yeah, so, and there can be, we can have a win, we can have a coexistence, and we can have, or we have a win, which means a species loses, right? So essentially one species kind of wins out, or we have a coexistence of species.
Is it the like,
So,
when you're
go ahead.
describing it, are you describing like the colors? Like, so you're saying like, oh, if it's within the blue, or are you giving a range of like, yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, maybe we'll just, if we don't understand as a group, that's also okay. If we haven't gotten here yet, that's no
I get it.
problem. Okay, then why don't we just talk about it as a group? So let's just break these down a little bit one by one, and we can kind of walk through each of these boxes. So for all of them, the x-axis is going to be the population size of species 1. So N, population size 1, species 1. The y-axis is N2, so it's population of species 2. So if we move to the right, anywhere in this box, so if we're up here and we move to the right, if we're down here and we move to the right, what does that do for species 1?
It puts it past its carrying capacity.
let's ignore carrying capacity just for right now. If we just move from left to right, what does it do to species one population?
Population grows.
Yeah, right. So let's just start basic. Population grows. If we go from bottom to top anywhere, population two grows, right? So now we know how population one grows. If we go left, population one shrinks. If we're up here and we go down, population two shrinks. So it can grow or it can shrink. And what we have is we have two isoclines, right? So this is isocline of species two, and this is the isocline of species one, which dictate where the carrying capacities are. So which species in this first box has a larger or higher carrying capacity?
Species one.
Yeah, right, because K1 is out here, so it's further away. It's almost to the edge of the line versus this one's more in the middle, right? So species one has the potential, it has a higher carrying capacity. Its isocline is also pushed out further too. So if we're down here, what direction are we going to move? For in the yellow.
There's only growth for both populations.
Yes, and why is that?
Because they both haven't reached their carrying capacity.
Exactly, awesome. So that's why there's three arrows, right? So this arrow is for species one. So this says we're going towards the isocline out here. Species one is growing, it's increasing in number. This arrow is going up and it shows that we're going up this way too. Anywhere on this isocline, no matter where we hit it, we're going to the right and we're going up at the same time. So both species one and both species two are growing or increasing in number. And that's why there's supposed to be like a bigger arrow in the middle. And what that means is that's its net effect between the growth of both populations. So when we hit the isocline, we can potentially hit the carrying capacities for species two, but we'd have to hit it right here. But if we get pushed into this blue box, what does that mean for the two populations?
It means that population two is going to decrease, and then population one will continue to increase, but yeah, and then the net is decreasing.
Well, it's only decreasing, it's going this direction. So if we went from here on the x-axis to here on the x-axis, that one increased, correct?
Yeah, so population one increases.
Yeah, so because now what we are is if we move from here to here, we go past the carrying capacity of species one. So that's why now the vertical line is down. So for species two, we go past the carrying capacity for species two, the vertical line is down. So species two is over its carrying capacity, so it's going to decrease in population. But the line for the x-axis remains the same, right? Because we're still below the isocline, so we're still below the carrying capacity. That's going to continue to increase towards the isocline as well. So the net effect is it's going to push it towards species one carrying capacity. And if we hit species one carrying capacity, what does that mean for species two?
That means that species two can continue to grow.
If we hit all the way down to this line right here, where this white dot is, what's the value for species two?
0.
Yeah, 0.
Yeah,
And if
so
it
the-
hits 0, species two dies out. It goes extinct. Species one wins and species two loses and goes extinct. That's what I was originally trying to get at with the win kind of loss scenario. So in this scenario, it favors species one because it has a higher isocline and a higher carrying capacity. Because even if we're out here, right, we cross this isocline, what does this mean now for both species?
They're both gonna die off. Or like species one is gonna die off.
Well,
Or-
they're not gonna, I wouldn't
it's
say
gonna
die
decrease.
off. Yeah, like
Yeah,
it's
it's
going to
gonna decrease.
decrease. You're definitely on the right track. Yeah, they'll both decrease, right? Because the X and Y or the Y axis is pointing down, the X axis is pointing to the left. The net effect is going back towards the isocline, but ultimately it's going to want to push towards this carrying capacity for species one. And then in this next box, what's the outcome of this scenario, do we think? What changed? Maybe let's back up. What changed in this box from A to B?
the carrying capacity of species 1 decreased and the carrying capacity of species 2 increased.
Right, yeah, these isoclines flipped. So like you said, species 2 now has the larger, greater carrying capacity than species 1. So if you notice, these arrows in the yellow and the green are exactly the same because that's below both carrying capacities. That's above both carrying capacities. But now, because of the larger carrying capacity for species 2, in the middle, it flips and it pushes us towards species 2. So this is a scenario where species 2 is generally going to win or win out, and species 1 is going to go extinct. So we have a scenario for species 1 winning out, reaching carrying capacity, species 2 going extinct, and the opposite scenario of species 2 winning out, hitting its carrying capacity, pushing species 1 to extinction. So, okay, with that being said, now we go to box C, right? So this is a little bit different now, right? We have our isoclines that are crossing. So what does this mean for the outcome?
Does it mean that there's like a point where their carrying capacities are equal and neither of them will survive?
Well, if we can see that where one difference visually is we have 2 white dots now, right? Versus here, we only have 1 single white dot. So this is going to depend, this is still a win-lose situation, but it depends on where you start or where you're located, right? If you're down here, you're below both carrying capacities, you're still going to go up, but if species 1 grows faster, we're going to end up in the blue box down here, and then it's going to push us towards species 1 carrying capacity, which eliminates species 2. If species 2 grows faster, we're going to get pushed in this direction, and we end up in this blue triangle, we're going to get pushed towards species 2 carrying capacity and eliminate species 1. So these are like, this is a species 1 wins, species 2 wins every time, and this is, it depends on where we start and who grows faster, essentially. Or if we're out here, it depends on who dies off faster, right? If we die off at a rate of species 2's higher, it's going to go to species 1 winning out. If we do the opposite, where the species 1 dies out faster and we have higher levels of species 2 is going to win out. Does that make any sense on how to follow these 3 boxes so far?
Yeah, so then that, yeah, so I think I was gonna jump ahead to the last box.
Yeah,
But then-
and that's exactly where we're going. So did you have a question about the last box?
I was gonna say then that means if there's the white circle means that they can coexist if they both reach that white circle in the middle.
Yeah, so this is generally going to be weaker competition because it's pushing for equilibrium or pushing for coexistence, not equilibrium, sorry. Equilibrium is when they coexist. Right, so this is going to be species 1 is generally a more superior competitor. This is species 2 is generally a more superior competitor. And this is going to be, they're probably equal competitors, but it depends where we start. And this one is maybe they're equal competitors or the competition is just not that fierce that neither species has to go extinct. Right? Because if we start down here, we're below, it's the same shape over here, but their carrying capacities are both pretty low. So if we come over here, are we above or are we below the carrying capacities for both species? With the white dot.
We're at the carrying capacity for both species.
Are we?
I mean, it's not above.
I agree with that statement. If we think, well, here, let's follow it on the x-axis. So, right, so here, if we go straight up, it's somewhere right here, right? So
that's
we're
below,
below,
yeah.
we're below that one. And if we go here, it's going to generally be somewhere over like here. So we're below that one, right?
Yeah. I
So
see that now.
no, based on what we know about carrying capacity, if we're below both species carrying capacities, they're not pushing themselves, to the brink of their possibilities. If they lived alone, they'd probably go up, but because they're together, they're competing, they're below their carrying capacities, so therefore they can coexist. Because if they push to species 1 carrying capacity, it still would kill species 2 off, right? Because we'd have to end up here on the plot, but if we're below it, it doesn't kill off the other species.
I see. Okay.
So, and these will, I'll say, be very important. You're gonna see them again on the exam and be asked, questions about them. Something might be like, what happens to species 2 as species 1's population increases, or vice versa? What happens to species 2 as species 1 population decreases? That would be the other population that can increase. And it could be asked, what is the most likely scenario to outcome of this given box? It would be, what would be the most likely scenario for this one? The top left.
Sorry, did you asked or you were giving examples?
I'm giving examples of potential questions, and for this one, I'm asking what the answer would be. So if the question is, what is the most likely scenario to result from this competition scenario, what would we say?
So we'd say both species would increase until the carrying capacity for species 2 was met and they would die off. No, carrying capacity of species 1 would get met and then the species 2 would die off. Therefore, they could not coexist.
Yeah, so I agree with what you said, and maybe a shortened version of that is the most likely scenario here is that species 1 will reach its carrying capacity and species 2 will go extinct. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was much shorter and much more concise.
Okay.
Okay, cool.
And it'll probably be like a multiple choice question. So you might get species 1 wins out where species 2 goes extinct, species 2 wins out, species 1 goes extinct, or vice versa. Both species coexist, both species go extinct, and then pick out what is the most likely answer. Okay, are there any other questions or comments about this predicting the outcome of competition? Okay, so then why don't we move to competition for multiple resources? So what they had here is they have an example of a species, 2 species competing for multiple resources, and kind of some of the big takeaways that they had here was that if species 1 is better able to sustain itself at low levels of both resources than species 2, species 1 will likely win the competitive interaction, right? Because they're less limited by those 2 resources. But there could be a situation where they can both coexist, and that would be when species 1 is better at persisting at low levels of resource 1, but species 2 is better at persisting at low levels of resource 2. So neither species then can really drive the other species to extinction, then this 2 species can coexist. So it kind of builds off of what we were just talking about with more of a real life example. And it gets beyond the Liebig's law of the minimum, that generally it's not one resource that's absolutely limiting, that species tend to use multiple resources and depend on both of them to some extent. Okay, and this gets into abiotic conditions can influence the outcome of competition. What was the abiotic condition in this barnacle example? Do you remember? Essentially, it was desiccation resistance, right? Because we have 2 barnacles living on these rocks in an intertidal zone. And what they did is, through a couple experiments, they noticed that this barnacle here on the left was always found at the top, and this other barnacle, the rock barnacle, was found in deeper water at the bottom. And what they found was when they removed the bottom barnacles, this top barnacle, Polystellet or something barnacle, the P barnacle we'll call it, was able to move down into the deeper water. So it showed that this rock barnacle was a superior competitor in this deeper water, that it prevented this other barnacle from coming down into the water. But then they thought, like, okay, what happens if we remove the top barnacle? is this competitor, since they're a superior competitor, are they going to be able to fill this space up here? And what they found was, no, they couldn't, right? So they scraped these off and they didn't move up, even though they prevented these guys from moving down. And the reason being is because when the tide goes out, these rocks are exposed to the air, and these deeper rock barnacles cannot sustain that desiccation. So, you know, it's kind of, so there's the abiotic condition influencing the outcome of competition. Whereas the pole barnacles or Polly's barnacles could sustain the lack of water or the desiccation. So that's kind of just a cool, again, real life example of, you know, how a superior competitor might do well in one environment, but in another environment, it might become an inferior competitor.
Is it like building on niches, right? Like that's his niche. So he can't live higher up.
Yeah, I
Even
would agree
though-
with that statement. Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's realized niche, you know, is down here. Even its fundamental niche, if we would calculate that, we could say like it can't survive these abiotic conditions. So here, you know, its fundamental and realized niche is the same essentially. This one is the opposite, right? Its fundamental niche is all of this, but its realized niche is right here because it's being interfered with where it can't go lower because this down here, it gets outcompeted. So exactly, you could relate this to the niches of these organisms as well. That's awesome. All right. And then what is this one? This is the consumers influence the outcome of competition. So this one's kind of cool too. So this has to do with 3 different types of toad juveniles or tadpoles, right? So we have the spadefoot toad, the southern toad, and the spring peeper, and they exposed them in controlled ponds where they controlled the number of predators exposed to them, and they looked at tadpole survival to metamorphosis, and they considered the higher survival rates to be superior competitors. So when they had no predators, it was very obvious who was the top competitor, right? The spadefoot toad had a very high survival rate. The southern toad had an intermediate survival rate, and the spring peeper had a very low survival rate. And these were the only 3 in that pond, so they were the ones essentially affecting each other's survival rates. But as they added more and more predators, you know, with 2 predators in the form of newts that ate the tadpoles, you see that there's no difference now between the southern toad and the spring peeper. The peeper did better, the southern toad did worse, but they essentially do equal now. And the spadefoot is still a top competitor, but not by as much of a difference. And as we add up to 8 predators, essentially now the spring peeper is the best competitor, has the highest survival rate, and the spadefoot goes down. So the presence of the predator, and it could be that, you know, maybe the spadefoot toad is really good at, you know, survives and eats a lot of food and outcompetes the other toads by itself, but is very susceptible to a predator. And they often they say that as kind of one of their examples that the better competitors are often more susceptible to predators, oftentimes because they're more active, like they're moving around for food more, they're fighting more, they're more, and that activity makes them more visible to predators. And if they're, you know, being territorial for food source, they might expose themselves more to a predator and get picked off more easily. Or there's a trade-off. Maybe they're not as good of a swimmer. Maybe they're bigger, so they can kind of bully these 2 around. But when the predator comes, they're easier to see and they can't swim away as fast and they can't hide as easily. So that's a possible trade-off. They didn't get into those details, but they do talk about possibilities of trade-offs. And I don't know what the exact trade-offs for these 3 species are, but that's one possible scenario. And the big point is, you know, you can be a good competitor, but you're often, you know, a biotic factor being a predator, that's going to have an impact on the outcome of competition. All right. And this is kind of another example with weeds. So, you know, kind of goes to the same exact thing as the tadpoles up here. Okay, and now we're gonna get into different types of competition, right? So what is competition by interference? What are we talking about with that?
It essentially means that like one species is interfering with the resources available for the other species. They
Yeah,
use
so yeah, go ahead.
so they use the example of the ants, like these two different ants, like one of the ants will wake up earlier and essentially like block the holes of the other ants. And so
Yep.
it's yeah, it's oh man, I just lost my train of thought. But yeah, that's what
No,
it's saying.
yeah, I mean, it's kind of in the title, right? We just have to, by interference. So they're directly interfering physically somehow. That could be an aggressive interaction, right? So if organisms become territorial and they're, hiding a resource, say that resource is access to a female, right? I worked with lizard species, and a lot of times male lizards will develop territories and they will physically display, charge, and attack other lizards of that species and keep them out of their territory. And they have other resources in their territory like shelter, water access, food access, something that would be attractive to females. The females come in and they're like, oh, I like this territory. And he's like, cool, this is mine. And I'm going to keep other males out and defend it. So like he's interfering with other males getting to that female as a reproductive resource by physically displaying to them or physically attacking them and sometimes fighting with them. So another way, like you described, is this ant example where one species of ant comes out, puts rocks on the outside of the other ant species nest, and it takes hours for those ants to dig out those rocks and unbury themselves essentially. So the whole time that those ants are digging themselves out, you see that these other ants are out, they're out feeding in high numbers. And as the ants dig themselves out and come out and increase their number, the ones that were out earlier decrease their number. They're inferior competitors, but then they interfere with the harvester ant getting, and it allows them time to get access to their food resource. So yeah, kind of an interesting, almost funny example of animals interfering with one another, but kind of cool and gets the point across.
We just put a bird feeder, like a hummingbird feeder at the house. And there is one hummingbird that just she sits and she watches the feeder. And if any other hummingbird comes, she like kicks its butt. And so we've named her Samantha, but she just every time she does not let any other birds feed on this feeder, and she'll eat the entire thing in a couple days. And it's fun to watch, that's for sure.
No, that does sound fun to watch. Hummingbirds are often quite aggressive and very territorial, so they will definitely protect feeders, and that's why a lot of times people will put 3 or 4 hummingbird feeders out, so they can't defend them all, so they can kind of rotate and other hummingbirds can come in. But it is really fun sitting at hummingbird feeders, and they're very active. And because the way they fly and that much aggression, it costs them a lot of energy. So it's not surprising that, she drinks the whole thing herself because she spends a lot of energy safeguarding that resource. So very cool. All right, so this next one is a little sometimes trickier, I feel, apparent competition. Does anybody want to take a stab at describing kind of what this is?
So I would classify it as like acts like non-intentional competition. And what I understood was like one animal might be a carrier of some parasite or something, and like not intentionally trying to kill off the other one, but because they can handle the disease a little bit better, that they pass it on to the species that can't handle it very well.
Yeah, so how many different organisms at minimum does apparent competition require?
2.
Just 2?
At least 2.
So what are, okay, in this in this example with the pheasant and the partridge, what are all the living organisms involved in this example?
There's three because it is a parasite. Yeah. So there's
Yeah, yeah,
Well,
there's
could
a
that-
minimum of 3.
could the same be said for like viruses, which like aren't living organisms? Like if one animal,
There's 3 players involved. Let's say that.
okay.
You
In the
you bring up a very
parent
fair
competition-
point. Yeah,
Okay, cool. Just making sure.
yeah. There's 3 players involved in a parent competition. The 2 organisms here, the pheasant and the partridge, that give the appearance that they're competing. And then the third player, which can be a parasite, it can also be a predator, right? So let's go through this example first, since it's what Cogswolves give us, and then we can talk about some other possibilities. So we have a pheasant and a partridge that appear in this, they overlap in their habitat, so they're in the same area. They have the same resource, so they feed on the same food source, so they're interacting essentially kind of near each other. They're generally not aggressive towards each other, so it's not like direct competition. But what happens is they both can carry a parasite. And what this graph shows us is that the pheasant carries the parasite at really high levels. So what we have is the pheasant, when there's no parasite eggs, they did an experiment where they caged up partridges and caged up pheasants. And they did, their controls were, they just looked at how many parasites and their eggs they had on them in these cages just naturally, right? So that's the red. The pheasants had a higher number than the partridge. Both were generally, not too high, but the pheasant still had a higher number. Then when they did a treatment where they threw these eggs and parasites onto the ground in these other cages and looked at how much they picked up, the partridges didn't pick up very much, right? There is an increase, but not a ton. The pheasants picked up a lot, right? That bar, it's like 6-7 times at least the red bar. So they are huge in carrying these parasites around. And what they don't show visually, which kind of, I wish they would show a second series of graphs, is that the parasite has little to no effect on the pheasant. So they can carry, say thousands of these parasites and just go about their day, and it has little to no detriment on their day. The partridge, on the other hand, if they were to carry thousands of this parasite, it's very harmful to them. So that's probably why they don't naturally carry a lot, and they probably evolved mechanisms to not pick them up as well, or they clean themselves very well. And the pheasants don't do that or don't have mechanisms because it doesn't matter. It'd be a waste of energy to evolve a mechanism or to clean themselves for something that doesn't affect you. But when they're interacting together at a food source, so they're both feeding like on seeds in a field together, the parasites jump from the pheasant to the partridge. And because the pheasants carry so many, they're just giving a bunch to the partridge, and the parasites have a really negative impact on the partridge. So the partridge numbers go down, and the pheasants either stay the same or they increase because their competitors for food source are gone. So it looks like the pheasant is a superior competitor than the partridge. But if we remove that parasite, then they're equal. So the parasite is really kind of the key player that is having the negative impact, making the appearance of competition. And that's why it's called a parent competition. And another one could be, we could say we have 2 different species of bird. They're equal competitors, but they have a shared predator. So say a coyote eats these 2 birds, right? The partridge is really good at flying away and evading the coyote and has really good eyesight. So when the coyote comes, they're both feeding in the same spot. The coyote comes out, the partridge takes off. The pheasant doesn't know what it's doing. It gets picked off, right? So that's the predator now is what looks like is, that's the apparent part of the competition, right? Because we would say if we just can focus on these 2, the pheasant would be decreasing in number because it's getting picked off. But until we discover that it's because of predation, an outside factor, we would think maybe it's competition between them, but it's really not competition. It's just apparent competition because the third party, the predator, is the one that's reducing the pheasant's number. It has nothing to do with the partridge. So in that made up scenario. So does that make sense, kind of what apparent competition is then?
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions about it, or? And if anybody watching this has questions or something I said didn't make sense, feel free to send me a message and I can clarify it that way too. Okay. So that's takes, I think, care of mostly what I wanted to cover for competition. So why don't we go ahead and now move into mutualisms? So actually, that's not where I wanted to, let's start at the beginning. All right, so it starts off with kind of a real life, interesting, almost, again, kind of almost funny kind of example. So bathrooms with benefits. So what does that mean? What are we talking about here?
They're talking about the shrew and how the shrew poops into the just like plant that then digests the feces in order to gain the nutrients needed.
Yeah, and then what does the shrew get out of it?
A very special nectar.
Yeah, right. So they both feed each other. They're both, a mutualism means that both parties that are interacting benefit to some degree from their interaction. So the shrew feeds the plant with its poop, and the plant feeds the shrew with nectar. So they both get types of nutrients from each other that they're not getting in outside in the rest of their diet. And then this gets into an example of how mutualists help each other essentially gain resources. So they talk about specialists and generalists here, and then they talk about obligate mutualists and facultative mutualists. What do we mean with what is a generalist versus a specialist, and considering in the context of mutualisms?
A generalist kind of will have a mutual relationship with multiple species, and then a specialist will have a mutualist relationship with just like one species, at least.
Yeah, exactly. A generalist can interact with and benefit with and have these mutualistic relationships with several species, just as you said, and a specialist has at least one, maybe two or three, but a small number of species. And then what about obligate mutualist versus facultative mutualist?
With an obligate mutualist, we're looking at like, in order for both of the species to survive, they need to have a mutual relationship. If one can't survive without the other, and then for a facultative, one can survive without the other, or they can survive without each other, but they're still helping each other out.
Yeah, exactly. Obligate, they depend on each other. You remove one of the two from the equation, the other one will die as well. Facultative, they both benefit from each other, but if you remove one, the other one will still survive. Like it gets a benefit from the relationship, but it's not detrimental or it's not required for it to survive. And then this one is just a very detailed example. You won't have to recall, I know they're bolded terms, but you won't have to recall the different types of fungi. If they come up in the exam, you'll just have to know that the fungi essentially provide some sort of benefit for the plant to absorb nutrients. And in return, the plant feeds the fungi a different type of resource. So this is just a very detailed plant example. And then they get into some details about animals and protozoans and animals and other animals. So this one I thought was kind of a cool real life example. So this is a bird. What do they call it? The honey guide. Yeah, that makes sense. So it's a honey guide in humans, essentially, is the mutualism here. The honey guide bird, or the greater honey guide, it likes to eat bee wax and it likes to eat bee larvae inside the honeycomb, but it has a hard time getting into the beehive. And humans, we like beehives because we like to eat the honey. So groups of people and this honey guide have learned to interact where they can actually call the birds in. The birds will find the beehives and circle around them. So this data set is showing the distance to the beehive. The bird will fly around from perch to perch, and as that distance from perch to perch gets smaller and smaller, they know that that bird is circling in closer and closer to the beehive. And these beehives, I don't know what species they are, but they're apparently hard to find, but the birds are better at it than humans. But then the trade-off is humans are better at opening and destroying these beehives. So they go in, humans, they open the beehive to drain the honey and they leave the broken beehive behind. And then this honey, the greater honey guide, can eat the larvae that are now exposed and eat the wax that is now exposed on the inside. So they both get a benefit of a food source, basically, from working together to find these beehives. Okay. And then this one is an example of how mutualists can protect each other. So here we have a type of like acacia tree, and we have ants, and ants live on the acacia tree, and the acacia tree provides them shelter and food in the form of some type of sugar or nectar. And then the ants provide protection for that tree. If an herbivore comes to chew on the leaves, the ants will actually go on that herbivore and bite them and sting them and attack them and kind of push the herbivore away to protect that tree. And they showed in this example that, this is a mutualism, but is this an obligate mutualism or is this a facultative mutualism?
It's facultative because both of the species can survive without each other.
Exactly. So then they show right here an example. The y-axis is the acacia stems containing herbivorous insects. So with ants, the herbivorous insects are insects that eat the leaves. When they have ants, there's a very low number of those present. Without ants, there's a high level of them present because the ants are the ones driving them away. So that makes sense. And then we look at survival of the trees. Without ants, it goes down, but not quite to zero. So the y-axis only goes down to 40. So it can survive, above zero without the ants. But with the ants, it survives at over 70%. So as you stated, it doesn't, it's not life and death without them necessarily, like they can still survive, just less of them at lower rates without the ants, but with the ants, it's an increased benefit for both of them. It doesn't show like the benefit directly for the ants in data here, but there is, like, as I said, the food benefit for the ants as well as the shelter. Okay, and then they give some more examples. Another animal defense is in fish. This is a pretty common one. So this is a cleaner wrasse. And then this is, I forget what this is. It's a bigger, more predatory fish. What the cleaner wrasse does is the predator doesn't kill the wrasse. It actually, in a sense, appreciates or allows its presence because the wrasse, in its name, it eats parasites off of this bigger predatory fish. So the wrasse gets the benefit of not being killed by a potential predator or even being bullied by a bigger competitor. And it gets a food source because it swallows and digests the parasites. And this bigger fish, the benefit they get is they get a reduced parasite load, which is beneficial to their health. And here's another example kind of the same thing. So this bird comes on and eats parasites and bugs off of these ungulates. I think it's a type of impala. So the bird gets the food source and the ungulate gets reduced parasite load or insect load. So they both benefit from it. All right. Then this talks about how mutualists can help plants reproduce, and not probably too surprising to people. Animals or insects can help plants reproduce through pollination, right? And the process of pollination is generally a plant produces some type of flower, produces a pollen and seeds, and then it also produces a nectar, and that nectar acts as an attractant to, in this case, bats. They come in, stick their head in the flower. They have to drink the nectar because it's down in the bottom of the flower. When they stick their head in that flower, their face gets all full of pollen, and then they drink the nectar, and then they move on to another flower to get more nectar, and they bring that pollen with them from one flower to the next and cross-pollinate different cactus in this case, and they get their food source is the bat's benefit, and the pollination breeding is the plant's benefit. So they both kind of win out on that interaction, as the case with all mutualisms. And again, it just kind of goes over some more examples. Another one is seed dispersal, right? Plants generally put fruit on a seed because animals like to eat that fruit part. And then the seeds are often not able to be digested. So animals will swallow that seed and then walk away, defecate that seed and transport it with fertilizer to another place. Or in the case, these ants pick up the fruit, carry it around to their nest area, eat the fruit off of it, dispose of the seed, and the seed gets dispersed throughout the area as well. So it's basically, as it says, seed dispersal, right? Because the animals get the fruit that they get to eat as a nutrient, and then the plant gets its seeds dispersed over a wider range than it can drop them. All right. Then it even gives some examples of how mutualism can enhance biodiversity. So this gives a direct example again with RAS, cleaner RAS. So back to the fish example, and it shows the abundance of fish. So just the total number of individuals with the RAS present, the bar is pretty high. Without the RAS, so when the RAS is absent, this bar is pretty low. So just the number of other fish total goes down without the RAS. And then this is a further breakdown of just the number of species. So with the RAS present, there's about 12 different species present. When you remove the RAS, there's about half of that, only about 6 species present. So that shows how the presence of a mutualism can increase biodiversity of a region. And this gives us some more examples of different species, kind of the same concept. Okay. And then this application, I thought this was pretty interesting too, right? Because it talked about how we used to have dispersers, such as the dodo was the example, where it ate fruits and then humans killed them off because they were easy to kill and they were a good food source at the time. So we caused dodos to go extinct by over harvesting or over hunting them. And we realized later we killed a seed disperser, but humans, learned a little bit more, and they came up with the idea we can replace that seed disperser. So actually in those areas down in the Galapagos, they move around Galapagos tortoise, and those can replace the dodos that were seed dispersers in the area and actually do the job for them. And there's debate on that, whether, humans further, human interference caused the problem, and then further human interference, is that really going to fix the problem? And in this example, it seems to be doing a good job. The Galapagos tortoise are not, reproducing in high numbers, so they're not going to turn into this, massive overtake of the area. All right, any other questions about mutualism? Okay, if not, we can go on to the third unit for today, get into predation. Okay, and some of this, hopefully we recognize that it's going to get into predator-prey cycles that we've seen it before, but it goes into a little bit more depth. And this study with the hare and the lynx, this was really cool. And it took over 100 years of multiple studies on this population of the cycling between, where's the, oh, I thought there was a plot on here. It's in the next, we'll get to it. It's not a big deal, sorry. So the point of this story is the lynx and the hare, their predator-prey cycles, they oscillate like we saw for the previous exams, right? Where when the prey population goes up, the predator population follows, causing a crash in the prey population, followed by a crash in the predator population. And they did a bunch of studies and found it slowly revealed the truth, because they thought it had to do with, like, was it sunspots at one time why they were seeing this population cycle? What did they ultimately find was the cause for the population cycles with the hares? Or what is the leading hypothesis to this day? Do we remember? Did we get this far?
Was it that the increase in lynx caused a decrease in the hair?
Well, it does, but they were curious because they even did studies where they caged out the lynx, right? And the hare still followed, not as deep declines, but it still cycled, even with the hare not being present. And they said they caged out the lynx, but there were owl predators, right? So there were still predators present that were in the area, and they didn't kill as many hare, but the hare's numbers still went down. There's a physiological response of the hare. Did we get that far yet?
I think I just missed. I think I was at that point in speed reading, but yeah, no.
No worries. So the physiological response is just the president of the hair caused a stress response in the hair. And they actually, not only were they getting killed by the predators, but when the predators were present, they were physically, the stress was causing them to produce less offspring. So that was a reason why it still cycled when the predation levels were, when predators were around, but not actively killing them at the same rate. So I thought that was pretty cool find. And then when the predators were gone, the stress was alleviated and they produced higher numbers. So it was that they were being eaten, but also just the sheer presence of a predator caused that physiological response in the stress response for them to not produce as many offspring. And it's interesting because unrelated, this is just a side note that I found interesting when I read this, is coyotes are the opposite. So coyotes are very hard to get rid of in an area because if you start shooting them and trapping them, that causes stress on their population, and the females will have larger or have more offspring. So they're, what do you call it? They're they'll produce more pups. So then the next generation is larger. It's actually, the opposite when they have a stress response.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Okay. And then not too surprising, this section talks about how predators limit the abundance of prey by physically eating them. So they did a pretty cool study to find I don't want to say basic result, but a very straightforward result, right? They had some islands where there were lizards present and spiders present. They removed the lizards from some islands and looked at the spider numbers. And what we see over time is the number of spiders are at much higher levels when the islands have no lizards. When the lizards are present, the islands have almost no spiders. So the spiders the lizards are very good at killing off the spiders. And then this is problematic because we think of terms of introduced and invasive species. So what's the difference between an introduced species and an invasive species?
Well, an introduced species is a species that's not native to a location,
Mhm.
but an invasive species is a species also that's introduced to a population, but will grow without or will like reproduce without any predators to stop it. So it's like it just will just keep going and then destroy the native population.
Yeah, so basically they're the same thing, right? As you said, an introduced and an invasive species are a non-native species that are put into a new area. But the reason then it switches from introduced to invasive is invasive species cause harm to the local populations. So if you have an introduced species that just kind of fits in, it doesn't grow rapidly, it doesn't kill off a bunch of other native species, we just say, yeah, that was introduced, it's not causing much harm. Generally, it's not much concern. But in the case of the brown tree snakes or something, I think they grew their population grew to high levels, and the local native organisms, particularly the birds, didn't have any evolutionary time to evolve defensive mechanisms to this species, so they were essentially defenseless, and the rat or the snake went in and destroyed and I think made 7 or 9 bird species go extinct and some lizard species as well. It just rapidly destroyed certain species in that environment. So that's why they're called invasive, because they're harmful to the environment. Okay. And then we get into different trophic levels. We have mesopredators versus top predators. And the top predators, I think the name kind of gives it away, right? That's the top of the food chain idea, such as like wolves, mountain lions, where they have competitors, but they don't really have any predators for themselves. Sometimes sharks, killer whales, orcas, those are often top predators. And mesopredators, those are kind of lower level on the food chain. So things like coyotes, weasels, the feral cats is another example in here. So they tend to eat herbivores, but get eaten by the top predators themselves. And the top predators eat the herbivores as well as eat the mesopredators. And they talk a little bit about the effect of removing top predators. So they talked about one example they gave was reduce the shark population because of overfishing it. Because a lot of times top predators are seen as competitors or predators to humans. So humans go out and remove them because they're an inconvenience or affecting their way of life. And what happens to the mesopredators when you remove the top predators?
The mesopredators will increase in population.
Yeah, right. If you relieve their predation pressure, like we saw in the cycles, when the predator level goes down, the mesopredator population or the prey population is going to go up, but generally that's followed by an increased predator population that then stops that from continuously growing, and that's why we get the cycles. But if there's no predator coming back, those mesopredators just keep growing until basically they reach their carrying capacity, and sometimes they can destroy ecosystems and kill a bunch of other species and have local extinctions occur. And it's not a good thing, in ecology to have a top predator generally removed from an area. They kind of keep competition of mesopredators and predation of mesopredators in balance and keep that ecosystem in balance. And we'll get into a really good example of wolves in Yellowstone for the next exam, but this is kind of a good setup for that. All right. And then this talks about herbivores limit abundance of plants. So again, not, kind of pretty straightforward. An herbivore, it's a type of predator, but it's like a specialist predator that only eats plants. So that's why it gives it special name of herbivore. And this example is one of the few times that humans used biological control, and it worked out in a good way, because in where was this? This is in Australia. Yeah, in Australia, the prickly pear cactus was an invasive species that was really hard to manage. And they found this insect, the cactus moth, that is larval stage or caterpillar stage, as we like to call them. It ate this prickly pear cactus, and it did a good job of wiping it out without destroying the rest of the environment. So it was actually kind of a good biological control for the environment. And then this study was pretty neat, I thought, too. So there's a predator-prey cycle in the laboratory. So what we've been talking about out in the field, they did it in a more controlled environment. So they had two species of mites, right? And they set them essentially in an arena. They had these rubber balls, which were their controls that the mites could walk on, but there was no food source. And then they also put oranges, that's what these orange balls are, out on the habitat, and that was a food source for the prey mite, and as well as a shelter. And did anybody, what did they find? Does anybody want to take a stab at kind of explaining the general results or the general patterns?
I skimmed, but I think what ended up happening is that the prey mite, the closer that the food source was together, the decrease in predatory mite is what I understood. I don't know if that's
predatory or prey mite?
Sorry, the prey mite. The prey mite. The closer the food sources together, the faster the prey mite would decrease in population, and the predatory mite would like increase in population.
Yeah, that's exactly what they found. If the spatial position of the food source played a role in the predator-prey interaction. If they were right near each other, a predator would go from one food source, some might escape over here, the predator would clean out one food source and then just move right here and clean out that food source, and they would drive their prey to extinction faster if the food sources for the prey were closer together. But when they spaced them out, the predator had a more challenging time finding that prey. So if they went to this food source, right, they could clear this out, but if some of them got away and they were here, here, and here, the predator would have to travel all this way to go clear this one out and then go clear this one out. And by the time maybe they cleared that one out, this one replenished itself from prey from these different food sources. So the complexity of the environment plays a big role in these predator-prey cycles. And the more complex there is an environment, the more they can live kind of in equilibrium and not push one or the other to extinction. It makes it more challenging or more difficult for the predator to push prey to extinction in a complex environment. And that's where they actually got to produce these cycles for the predator-prey cycles that have these legs that we see out in the environment. Because even we think the hare and the lynx, they're in pretty complex forested environments. You know, it's not just an open field for everybody. So there are hiding places and complexities. So they are able to reproduce what they would refer to as more ecological results, more natural results kind of thing. Okay. And then with this, we get into more mathematical models of predator-prey cycles, but like with competition, there's no activities to practice these, so we're not going to do any calculations for predator-prey cycles on the exam. You might see a calculation and be asked questions about it, so understanding it conceptually, again, is going to be important, like understanding what these terms kind of mean. And if we increased one, what would likely be the outcome? If we decreased another term, what would likely be the outcome? Would the prey population increase? Would the predator population increase? Or vice versa, would one decrease or one increase? So they're not going to be anything where you have to do any type of math. You just have to know, like, if you subtract a bigger number, is it going to go down? If you add a bigger number, is it going to go up? Or multiply or divide by bigger, smaller number, is it going to kind of go up or down? So that's really the math. The only math consideration we'll be responsible for on this exam. But it does go through and explain, you know, in detail kind of how to do these, but so it'll help us conceptually understand what these terms are and how they can be used to predict predator and prey cycles. But what I like better is the visual, because this explains it a little bit better, kind of like we saw with competition. So here again are just very simplified diagrams of, this is a prey isocline. So on the x-axis, we have the number of prey for both of these, and on the y-axis, we have the number of predators. So if we're just on the prey isocline and we're going left to right, if we're over here, we're going to have an increase in the number of prey. We follow the arrows. If we have a high number of prey, we're probably going to cycle down and have a decrease. And same thing with a predator, high numbers, so high on the y-axis is going to cause them to generally go down, and low numbers on the y-axis are generally going to cause them to go up. And what we see then is what this does right here. If we take this, think of these as like pieces of paper. If we take this piece of paper and we place it over the top of this one, this is how we create this one, right? So if we have top left on this one is blue, top left on this one is blue, that's why we have blue here. Bottom left over here is blue, bottom left over here is yellow, that's why they made it green. Bottom right is yellow, bottom right is yellow, that's why this is yellow over here, and then top right is yellow, top right is blue, and that's how we get the green. So that's kind of one way to think about how this becomes this. And what it says is, it has a text here, right? We can say when we have high levels on the y-axis, so high levels of predators, and we have low levels on the x-axis, so low levels of prey, so we're going to have, that means verbally, we have a decrease in prey population causes a decrease in the predator population, so that goes down. And then if we're in the bottom left here, that's going to be low levels of both. So a decrease in the predator population allows an increase in the prey population. So essentially it says a low level of a predator population allows a low level of prey population to begin to increase. And then if we think about where we are on the chart here, we're in the bottom right of both. So we have a high number, we're far on the x-axis, we have a high number of prey, but we're low on the y-axis, so we have a low number of predators. So then it's not surprising, an increase in the prey population allows an increase in the predator population, right? So they tend to go from low to high, high to low, and then so on. And that's how we get this continuous cycle. And the more we get to the center here, this is the joint equilibrium, we're going to have less and less cycles. The closer we are to that equilibrium, the more we spread out, the wider the oscillations of those cycles are going to be. And then it takes it a third step where it actually kind of unfolds it and puts the actual cycles on there, right? So if we think about here, we're in the yellow. For this box right here, we have a low number of predators and a high number of prey. So it says an increase in the prey population. So prey is going up, right? We see that allows an increase in the predator population. We also see an increase in the red line. So they're both going up in the yellow. That's what the arrow indicates. And as we move into this green one, an increase in the predator population, so red is still going up, causes a decline in the prey population. So green is now going down. And same thing in the blue, right? So now we have a decrease in the prey population causes a decrease in the predator. So the prey is green going down and the predator is red and it's going down. And then we see the predator population continue to go down in this green box and the prey switches to going up. So it's just kind of a nice way to visually show the predator prey cycle and how it repeats itself and what's happening in which part of the cycle. And as far as the exam, it's going to be good to know like what generally happens to a predator population if the prey population goes down. The answer would be that the predator population would also go down. What would happen to a prey population if the predator population goes down? The prey population will tend to go up. So you might see that in like a multiple choice setup where you get the different possible scenarios and you have to know what, there's usually two parts to this. So, it'll be kind of fill in the blank of one of them, or you could see this as a true false question. And one of the, the whole thing is correct, or one of these is going to be false, or both of them are going to be false, and having to recognize, therefore, if it's true or false. Okay. And then I think this is the last thing that I really wanted to bring up are these different functional responses. Because there's type 1, type 2, and type 3 functional response, and they show them graphically in two different ways, right? So this first one, it shows the number of prey consumed per predator. So this is kind of, you think about individual, and then the density of the population. So how many individuals are in the prey population. So as we can see, they kind of all tend to go up, right? As the density goes up, the predators are eating more individuals, and that makes sense because there's more individuals available to eat. The other population, or the other figure actually changes a little bit. This is a proportion of prey. So 5 out of 10, 10 out of 20, 10 out of 15. It's some part of the whole. And we see different responses. We even see different responses for, we see the same general trend, but they're not the same exact lines. And what are the differences? Like, what is a type 1 response? Why is it stable and then plateau? What's happening here? So we see kind of this linear response, right? So there's a linear response that the predator is just eating more and more and more, in this linear response. And then what happens here? Why does this go flat? What happens to the predator?
Predator stops eating.
Yeah, it becomes, they use the term satiated, but yeah, exactly. The predator's full, it's satiated, so it stops eating. And that's why, like, for a type 1, it's just a linear response. So it's eating, 5 out of 10, 10 out of 20, 20 out of 40, and then it stops and it, drops off and it eats less, right? The proportion increases in the population because the predators stop eating. In a type 2 curve, why does it seems to start fast and then it tapers off? What happens here? What would explain the tapering? What's the predator's doing something a little different here?
Interesting. So it says that the predator is spending time handling the prey, so he's not eating as fast as he normally would if the prey wasn't like moving around so much.
Yeah, handling time. That's why it's not a linear trend. The first one, the predator, it could eat 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 at the same rate. This one, 1, 2, 4, maybe when it gets to like 3 or 4, I think the example they gave was a pelican, right? If it puts fish in it, if it's bill, it can't swallow 4 straight down. It has to move them around so it can swallow them one at a time. So that adjustment inside of its bill, while it's doing that, it's not hunting any other food. So that's why it tapers off. The more it puts in its mouth, the more it has to actually handle those and move them around before it can swallow them. And then eventually it plateaus because at a certain point, the predator again is going to become satiated. And that's why we get a gradual decline in the proportion that it's eating. And then type 3 functional response. So it's kind of like an S curve, right? So it starts off quick, then it slows down. So it changes speed, where this one starts off linear and then tapers off. So what could explain, did they say, that to get this S curve?
I think it's a combination of both. Of
Of
type
what?
1 and type 2. So like the predator, there's like a combination of like handling the prey, but then also becoming full. And so
Yeah,
then like
so handling it again is definitely one of them that it talked about. Does it get in? Yeah, so it goes down here. So it also goes into searching for prey. So it could be that it's learning about its prey, right? So that it might not be very good in the very beginning catching its prey because it might be hiding. But once it learns about it, it actually gets really efficient as a predator, and then becomes, handling time slows it down, and then it becomes satiated. So this beginning part is kind of a learning curve for the predator to become an efficient predator. So it's a combination of two things, as you said, but learning and then handling are the two things that are causing that curve.
oh, it also says prey switching.
Yeah, and prey
And
switching, yeah, because if it's really good at catching one prey, it might not be good at catching another type of prey.
Interesting.
So
Okay.
yeah, that's a very good point. So it could be, instead of learning, it could be prey switching. I'm glad you brought that up. I forgot about that one.
Yeah, it says both of those factors, which is great. It's nice. It's nice to like hear it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No, I agree. And that's why I think having a discussion is good, because we learn different ways. Some people, can read text and are very good at learning. Some people are visual. So I'm glad they have both of that in here. And then this is kind of like gives us talking about it into discussion and thinking about it a little differently. So. All right. Are there any other questions about predation? Because that's about it's really everything that I wanted. I mean, there's a case, but you got to watch, some videos. We're not going to watch those during office hours, but if anybody has questions about that, I can answer some of those.
No.
Are any
I don't
questions
have,
about? Okay.
I don't have
All
any,
right, go
I don't
ahead.
have any questions, but this was really
Okay,
helpful.
then. That's good to hear. I'm glad that this can be helpful. Anybody else in the group have any questions about the 3 topics we went over today? Okay, if not, we can go ahead and call it a session, and then we're gonna have another office hour tomorrow where we'll finish off the other 2 sections. Okay, yep, from the chat note. And then yeah, that'll be covered everything for the exam that we will have available on Friday. So thank everybody that was able to join and participate. And if anybody watching has any further questions, obviously, send me a message. And I will see the group tomorrow.
Bye.